In 2024, another hardcore sci-fi drama has arrived. An astronaut narrowly escapes death from the International Space Station and returns to Earth, only to find that the people and things he once knew have undergone eerie changes. Is it time travel or alien forces at play? Let's find out together. The female lead, Jo, drives on a rural highway with her daughter, the radio repeating a hoarse whisper. She calmly reassures her daughter that everything is normal, and they soon arrive at a cabin in the forest. After unpacking, Jo quickly runs outside and secretly hides a package containing a strange metal can. Suddenly, her daughter's voice calls out from afar, yet she is clearly asleep in the room. Jo seems to realize something and resolutely walks toward the distance. 5 weeks earlier, Jo was still on the International Space Station. Through a video call, she tells her daughter Alice that she will return to Earth in 84 days and that today they would undertake a special mission to experiment with a newly discovered substance that remains active only in zero gravity. As everything is prepared, the commander had just activated the experimental equipment when suddenly a loud bang is heard, followed by a rapid drop in pressure, and a metal rod flies in, impaling the commander's arm. The ground control center issues an emergency notice for a sudden depressurization accident, ordering all astronauts to enter Escape Pod 1 and execute the emergency evacuation procedure. By then, the compartment where Jo was located had returned to normal. Seeing a colleague trapped by a fire in the corridor, she quickly picks up a fire extinguisher, clears a path, and escapes, closing the door to the burning compartment. The crew begins to count heads, with the commander in the worst condition, having fallen unconscious due to his arm being severed. Jo temporarily takes over as commander, staying behind with the doctor to administer emergency treatment, while the others check the station for damages. One piece of bad news after another arrives: the station's power and life support systems are damaged. The first escape pod's power system is faulty, but the second can be used, although it has only 3 seats. However, this isn't the worst of it. In the laboratory of the Ground Control Center, the space station project leader, Henry, marvels at the experimental data received just before the accident and issues an unthinkable order, insisting that the astronauts repair the station and continue the experiment no matter what. Upon receiving the order, Jo has no choice but to open the hatch, don her spacesuit, and go out into space to perform repairs. When she reaches the damaged part of the hull, she finds the power system severely damaged, the external cables destroyed, and without the proper equipment, she is unable to reconnect them. Hearing this, the commander immediately orders all astronauts to return to Earth, completely ignoring Henry's protests to continue the experiment. At that moment, the sun just crosses the horizon, illuminating the position of the space station. Jo, using the light, accidentally discovers a 50 centimeters crack in the station's outer shell. Could this have been caused by the recent impact? Jo tries to adjust her position to get a better look, but as she moves the cables, a horrifying face appears before her. The impact object was the body of an astronaut. Jo is so frightened that she loses her balance and would have drifted into space with the body if not for her safety tether. After finally returning to the cabin, Jo receives another piece of unfortunate news: the original commander has died from excessive blood loss. Now only 4 astronauts remain, but the second escape pod can only seat 3. Everyone looks at each other. Obviously no one wants to stay behind. Eventually, Jo decides to stay and repair the first escape pod, while the other 3 take the second pod back to Earth. The control center immediately approves the plan. As the space station's life support system can only sustain 1 person for 19 hours, the teammates one by one enter the second escape pod, which then initiates the separation procedure. Watching her companions gradually fade away, Jo's heart is filled with sadness. She too wishes to return and reunite with her family. At that moment, Jo's daughter and husband have already boarded a plane heading to the Space Command Center, along with the daughter of the deceased commander. Their greatest wish is to see their loved ones return to Earth at the first opportunity, and Jo is doing her utmost to make that reunion possible. The power system of Escape Pod 1 was damaged in the accident and must have its batteries completely replaced. As time ticks away, the command center finally receives good news: the other 3 astronauts in Escape Pod 2 have successfully entered the atmosphere and soon after safely landed, all unharmed. This result is exhilarating. Now it's up to Jo's performance. But at this moment, she isn't performing the power repairs but rather retrieves a bracelet necklace given to her by her daughter from the rest area. Jo had just replaced half of the batteries when the command center suddenly issues a new mission. She is to go to the experimental cabin and retrieve the new substance and the experimental device. It turns out that the laboratory director Henry had previously ordered the second escape pod to bring the items back to Earth. But the instruction was intercepted by the command center director because she felt that the accident might be related to the new material experiment. Henry, trembling with anger, scolds the other party for not understanding what the experimental data means. It represents an existence that could change the entire world. The command director is somewhat uncertain and reluctantly issues the retrieval order to Joe, who doesn't immediately agree, as she isn't sure if there will be enough time to go to the lab after replacing the batteries. By then, Joe's husband and daughter have finally arrived at the command center, and they are about to communicate when suddenly the communication signal is lost. Joe is anxious, seeing the emergency lights in other cabins begin to go out one by one, likely due to the backup power running out. She must set aside her distractions and accelerate the repair process. Suddenly, a noise is heard in the silent cabin, so she drifts toward the sound. Just after arriving at the lab, the surrounding scene suddenly changes. Joe finds herself inside a building with air and gravity, as if she has returned to Earth. Curious, Joe explores forward until she reaches the end of the corridor, where she sees the necklace given by her daughter. Turning back, the surroundings revert to the space cabin's appearance. Then, behind her, the voice of her daughter Alice, accompanied by a "Mom," pulls Joe back to the beginning of the story. She continues toward the source of the voice and soon arrives in front of a cabin, curiously surveying her surroundings. The snowflakes floating in the air seem to slow down, and Joe, astonished, pushes open the door to find that the interior is strikingly similar to her own cabin. She continues exploring until she reaches the end of the hallway, where she sees her daughter's necklace again. Opening the door, another Alice appears before her. At that moment, she doesn't have time to think. She immediately picks up her daughter and heads toward her own cabin. The other party, tormented by the severe cold, is extremely weak. Joe hastily starts a fire to boil water, needing to warm her daughter up quickly. Just after putting her in the bathtub, Joe suddenly remembers that another Alice is lying in the room. She keeps thinking, how can there be two identical daughters? When she turns back, the Alice in the bathtub has disappeared. The Alice sleeping in the room is awakened by the shouting, and Joe approaches and sniffs, convinced that the girl before her is not her daughter. Suddenly, the surroundings change, and Joe wakes up in the space station, checking her watch to find that she had been unconscious for several hours. Could it be due to low blood oxygen levels? Seeing that she doesn't have much time left, Joe must speed up the repairs. Suddenly, a piece of white cloth slowly floats toward her. She quickly raises her flashlight to shine on it, only to find that the commander's body has unexpectedly opened its eyes. With some trepidation in her heart, she gathers her courage to close his eyes and cover his head with the white cloth. The surroundings are eerily quiet, prompting Joe to record a message for her daughter to dispel her fears. She hears a hoarse human voice outside the cabin, but when she stops recording, the voice also disappears. Joe tries playing the previous recording, which indeed includes a hoarse male voice. She turns on her flashlight and searches the cabin again. Through the window glass, she sees a severed hand floating in the air. Opening the cabin door, she discovers it is the commander's severed arm. At this moment, Joe can't tell if it's a supernatural event or a hallucination caused by lack of oxygen. She must focus all her attention on replacing the batteries. With only 90 minutes left, the escape pod's power is finally restored. Joe is about to initiate the separation procedure when she sadly discovers that, due to the communication interruption, the escape pod hasn't received the latest return trajectory parameters. This information is akin to an automatic driving route plan. Without it, the escape pod is likely to land in a densely populated city center. Fortunately, Joe's professionalism shines through. She refers to the parameters used by the second escape pod yesterday and, combining this with the current time, manually calculates the latest trajectory parameters. Seeing that there is still enough time, Joe remembers the mission issued by the command center, so she runs to the laboratory and retrieves the new material along with the experimental device. After hurriedly entering the trajectory parameters, there isn't much more Joe can do. Whether it succeeds is now up to fate. She records all the words she wants to tell her daughter into the computer. After securing the cabin door, she doesn't hesitate to initiate the separation procedure, only to see the system suddenly light up with warning lights. Joe flips through the manual and discovers a bolt system malfunction, which requires two people to manually resolve. She feels a chill up her spine. Could she really die here? But at that moment, the bolt malfunction unexpectedly resolves itself, and as the escape pod slowly separates from the space station, Joe incredulously widens her eyes, for she sees a figure standing inside the departing main cabin. As the escape pod approaches Earth's atmosphere, it begins to separate in stages, eventually plummeting toward the ground like a comet. The command center immediately captures the signal, but they find that Joe has used a ballistic landing, making it difficult to predict the landing site in advance. At that moment, Joe also receives a signal from the command center, and it takes her great effort to open the response button. When they hear Joe's voice, The command center erupts in celebration, but as the escape pod continues to accelerate, the location signal is lost again, and the command center hastily dispatches a large number of personnel to search, as they can only roughly calculate the fall range. Before long, the escape pod descends to a safe altitude, and the opened parachute, like a giant's arm, firmly grasps it, accompanied by a loud noise. Jo finally lands successfully. She doesn't know how long it has been when she wakes from unconsciousness. The moment she opens the cabin door, Jo greedily breathes the long-lost air, only to see a wild wolf enter her field of vision. Terrified, her body stiffens, but just as the creature is about to pounce, a gunshot rings out from afar. It turns out the search and rescue team has arrived. A large group of medical and armed personnel surround Jo like stars around the moon. Only when she sees her husband and daughter does she feel that all her efforts were worthwhile. However, the commander's family isn't so fortunate. They are greeted only by their loved one's cold body. Meanwhile, Henry is most concerned about his special substance. He eagerly starts the equipment, calls up the experimental data inside, but doesn't find the device's contents, which again emit a strange glow. At that moment, Jo contentedly watches her daughter, but in the next instant, only Alice remains on the helicopter. She stands up, looks around, and finds the entire world empty, with Jo also experiencing something similar. Fortunately, when she turns her head again, her daughter's figure reappears, but her gaze seems somewhat vacant, especially when Jo habitually speaks Dutch. The other party seems not to understand, leaving it unclear which of the two, mother or daughter, is experiencing the problem. Looking at Jo, who lies stiffly in the examination equipment, Alice's heart harbors the thought that her mother might already be dead. The next day's news conference relentlessly probes the cause of the space accident. Jo is about to answer when a colleague immediately interrupts, stating that the joint investigation has not yet concluded and there is nothing to report at the moment. Jo just wants to end everything here and enjoy life happily with her family. However, the Space Station Joint Command explicitly requires that Jo stay at the space base until the cause of the accident is clarified. She can't go anywhere else. Under the deliberate matchmaking of various parties, a grand accident investigation hearing officially begins, with all 4 surviving astronauts in attendance. The head of the investigation team, Irina, who was the overall commander of the previous space evacuation operation and belongs to the Russian Space Agency, hears Jo's claim that the object that struck the space station was the body of a Soviet female astronaut from the 1960s. She logically concludes that it's impossible. A body couldn't possibly drift in space filled with debris for decades. Moreover, the joint agency has never received any reports of an astronaut dying or disappearing in the nearby area. She instead believes that the so-called female corpse is a hallucination Jo experienced due to lack of oxygen. The two sides argue back and forth, neither willing to give in, because if the impact object is confirmed to be the Soviet woman's corpse, Russia would bear the main responsibility for the accident. After the hearing is paused, Jo returns to her dormitory to eat and notices that her husband's hairstyle has changed. However, she likes it very much, although her husband clearly feels somewhat uncomfortable, as the previous Jo had never complimented him like this. That night, Jo, who is mobility impaired, prepares to go to the restroom with her daughter's help but accidentally falls midway. Alice goes to find her father for help, and Jo turns around to find that the corridor has turned into the one she encountered in the space station. The same bracelet hangs on the wooden door at the end. Until her husband comes to help her up, the eerie corridor is still there. Meanwhile, at the space experiment base, Henry confidently introduces to his assistant that this special substance can generate a dual quantum signal at the moment of collision, but it is difficult to record it. He plans to conduct the experiment again at the base, but despite a whole afternoon passing, the special substance undergoes no changes. The assistant, holding almost blank data, advises Henry not to waste any more effort. However, Henry insists he is right. When he retrieved the equipment yesterday, he indeed monitored a dual quantum state, exactly like the data in the space cabin lab. The stubborn old man disregards his assistant's skeptical look and continues to monitor the equipment on his own. Close to midnight, the mysterious dual quantum signal finally appears. The professor prepares to record it with his mobile phone, only to discover that it cannot be displayed in the video. He can only take up pen and paper, stick it to the screen, and trace it in a simple diagram, depicting the dual quantum state. The next day, Henry excitedly shows it to his assistant, who simply comments, "Nice drawing skills." Henry leaves the lab dejectedly, unaware that the special substance in the equipment has begun to flicker again. At that moment, Henry's attention is completely drawn to the strange phenomenon downstairs. A little girl in black just ran into the garage, and another girl of similar size carrying a toy rabbit also followed. It turns out to be Jo's daughter Alice. playing hide and seek with the deceased commander's daughter Wendy. As Alice hides under a car wheel, she inadvertently sees Wendy throw her beloved doll on the ground and stomp on it. Alice quickly runs out to stop her, but Wendy and the dolls suddenly disappear. Alice then runs out to confront her, but Wendy feels that Alice is distorting the truth, simply wanting her doll back. However, when Alice picks up the toy to check, she finds no dirt on it. Could she have been seeing things? Soon after, Henry comes over and starts talking about quantum physics, apparently having noticed some clues earlier and planning to give Alice some introductory education. Henry explains that many phenomena in this world cannot be explained by classical physics theories. For example, the same thing can exist in two different states simultaneously, like the rabbit, which appears white in one world but might be gray in another. There is a critical space between the two worlds, and as long as it is in the critical space, the rabbit's color can switch between white and gray at any time. Alice listens, somewhat understanding, but unaware that Henry's experiment with the dual quantum state using the special substance is intended to simulate two different states of an object in the critical space. Meanwhile, Joe faces a second hearing. This time, Irina brings more convincing evidence. According to the style of astronaut suit Joe provided, she found a space station garbage bag from the 1970s that looks extremely similar to it. It's very likely that Joe, under great pressure, mistook the garbage bag for a body. After the meeting ends, Joe's colleague comes over to comfort her, stating that he has always been on her side. After saying this, he reaches out to touch Joe's face, but she resists vehemently, surprising her handsome colleague, who seems puzzled by her reaction. The next morning, Joe and the other three astronauts prepare to pay respects to the deceased commander. At this time, she still insists that she wasn't mistaken, even finding a photo online of an astronaut suit identical to the one she saw, with her colleague reminding her that the astronaut in the photo is the investigation team leader Irina. Joe is stunned and speechless for a long moment. After paying respects to the commander, Joe plans to stay behind and think, but just as she stands up, she sees the deceased commander appear before her. Upon closer inspection, there is nothing there again. In the following hearing, Joe straightforwardly admits to Irina's conjecture, stating that what she saw was indeed a space garbage bag, because she really doesn't want to stay here any longer. Finally back in her long-missed home, Joe feels everything is so familiar, only curious about when her husband changed cars. The car at home was clearly red before. Her husband pauses for 2 seconds on the spot. Our car has always been blue. Meanwhile, Irina knocks on Henry's dormitory door. It turns out that the two are not only work partners who have been to space together on a mission, but their relationship in private is also quite special. Hearing that Irina has cancer and won't live much longer, Henry decides to cherish the few private meetings they have left. But when emotions deepen, Irina suddenly turns into a mummy. Simultaneously, on a cruise ship somewhere on the high seas, another Henry calls a detective investigating him to the deck. He says he has never experienced a space accident in his life. The detective curses him for talking nonsense, as it's very likely that Henry caused the death of 2 colleagues in a space station accident 30 years ago. Henry's anger is completely ignited, and he pushes the detective into the sea. This concludes the content of the first 3 episodes. Many puzzles can now be solved. According to the experimental director's dual quantum theory, the bolt malfunction Joe encountered during her return indicates that she died in World 1. The one who successfully returned to Earth is Joe from World 2, but it's unclear why the consciousnesses of the 2 worlds are mixed. The commander, who might not have died in the second world, helped Joe resolve the bolt malfunction, allowing her to return to Earth successfully. Joe encountered a mummy in space, which was actually Irina from another world. The person Alice saw destroying the doll was actually herself from another world. Henry had already seen everything clearly, and more interestingly, his counterpart in another world even killed the original world's detective, which could lead to unpredictable consequences. In World 1, Joe's marriage is only in name. She is possibly with her colleague, but Joe in World 2 hasn't changed her heart and continues to love her husband. Hence, the two have memory discrepancies, such as the red and blue cars.